In the center of the planet, there sleeps the great Earth Dragon, a being of incomprehensible might. So immense is his power that even his dreams change the world, granting special individuals on the surface extraordinary powers beyond those of mortal men. This is the Earth of the Mirage universe, and you're listening to the Mirage Barrage. Which is more powerful, superheroes or a modern military? Okay, that's a stupidly broad question, and the answer is going to depend a lot on what you mean by powerful, how many and which superheroes you're counting, and which military you're talking about, especially if you're talking about the entirety of the armed forces of a given country. I get the feeling that some people underestimate how effective military hardware is against superheroes. So let's do a quick comparison. Let's compare the kinetic energy of a few different things. Now this is going to be very rough because there are a bunch of other factors to consider. Where is the other guy getting hit? What is the other guy like? Do they have endurance powers or super durability? Also, what is this attack shaped like? A fist is going to impart its force across a larger area than a bullet would, which would seriously alter how much damage you'd take. But let's take a look anyway. Let's start with a punch from an untrained man. This could fall somewhere around 100 joules of kinetic energy. Now, a professional boxer will perform astonishingly better, potentially reaching over 1,000 joules, 10 times more than the untrained man. 10 times. Now let's compare that to a shot from the M4 carbine, which is a pretty standard weapon for the US Army. A single shot has about 1,800 joules, which may seem surprisingly low when compared to the kinetic energy of a professional boxer's punch. This is where it's important to remember other factors such as how the shape and size of a bullet will change things. Let's also not forget that the M4 can fire somewhere between 700 and 950 rounds per minute, which translates to around 11 to 15 rounds a second. But that's just an infantry rifle. What about some other hardware? Let's take the main gun on an A-10 Warthog. A shot from this beast has 200 kilojoules of energy. What's a kilojoule, you ask? Well, 1 kilojoule is 1,000 joules, so a shot from an A-10 is about 200,000 joules, or roughly 200 times more energetic than a professional boxer's punch, and a little more than 100 times more energetic than a shot from an M4. This gun also has a high rate of fire at 3,900 rounds per minute, or about 65 a second. But let's get bigger. Let's take the primary weapon on the M1 Abrams, the main battle tank for the United States Army and Marine Corps. A shot from this has about 33 megajoules of kinetic energy. And for the record, a megajoule is 1 million joules, making a shot from the M1 Abrams 33,000 times more energetic than a punch from a professional boxer. Needless to say, humans have gotten pretty good at creating things that go boom. Compared to that, do superheroes have a chance? Well, in a word, yes. And no. The problem is superheroes are so widely varied in powers and abilities that it's difficult to generalize. But this great variance also gives supers the ability to do things that the military can't. Some supers, like Invincible or No Man, can render any attack made against them entirely useless. Those with incredible strength, like Captain Cosmos or also Invincible, can direct their destructive potential into precise strikes and also use it for non-destructive purposes. Reading minds, turning invisible, supersonic sprinting, and much, much more are all things with great potential that a standard non-powered military doesn't have access to. But when we ask which is more powerful, we're kind of asking which has more effect on the world stage. And the answer to that isn't clear. Obviously, militaries have an extremely large impact on the world, and the fact that so much personnel and equipment make up a military means that their influence can be dispersed throughout the globe. Superheroes, in contrast, are much rarer, and as powerful as they can only be at one place at a time. Well, unless that's their power, but you know what I mean. And yet, a superhero's potential may be far greater, as many could perform special operations it would take teams to do otherwise. A single superhero can negotiate, retrieve something while under fire, and direct a large amount of powers just by thinking and doing, without having to worry about their commands being misinterpreted or working with a team or the like. Long story short, it's understandable why the military would be deployed against enemy supers, as they have great destructive potential. However, it's just as understandable why sometimes they'd be ineffective, or why sometimes they'd call in a super instead. Unfortunately for those in Phoenix, Arizona, now under assault by some previously unseen mechanical spider thing, the supers who could arrive immediately in response to the request for assistance weren't the best suited for the threat. The swordsman reduced the zoom on his goggles. With 3 green lenses, they vaguely resembled night vision goggles, and certainly had the same capability amongst many others, but were shaped like trapezoids, making them appear almost like an inverted radiation symbol. The swordsman watched as a rocket hit one of the monster's flailing tentacles. A piece of it splintered off, and the mechanical creature tried to retract it as it had the others. However, the chipped edge caught briefly on the lip of the socket connecting the arm to the body. As the monster tried to pull it further into the body, a strip of the flexible metal was sheared off until the limb aligned itself correctly with the socket. A moment later, and it re-emerged, good as new. The swordsman frowned, the expression invisible under the half-mask covering his lower face. "I don't know what we're going to accomplish here," he muttered. "If you don't believe you can be of use," the helmeted super behind him said, "then I'm quite skeptical my own abilities will make a difference." The helmeted hero wore nearly all black, with the exception of a splash of white around the helmet's visor, like a mask with 2 eye holes, and a red backpack attached around his torso like a vest. The armor around his forearms and lower legs was also a little more silver than black. The swordsman's outfit was also a flexible armor, but his was blue and gray, with 2 sheathed swords strapped to his belt and held up to his back for storage. While his forearms had thick armor, his shoulders and upper arms were bare, as was the top of his head, revealing graying hair. They watched from the top of a building as several blocks away the machine ripped through another fire team. "Still, sitting around here isn't going to accomplish anything," the helmeted hero said. "Are the next heroes inbound?" the swordsman asked. "ETA 2 hours. And no one else is available. Most of the Stormbreakers are off-planet or on other assignments, as are most of our other heavies, and even TAC Force 3. Of those remaining, most are underqualified for this threat. Sending them in would be, at best, as effective as the Army or National Guard forces. But if these heroes were eliminated, we'd lose tactical flexibility for other threats. Best not to call them in." "Then why are we here?" "It eases the minds of those in charge to think some supers are on site. Even if we can't do anything?" "Even if we can't do anything." The swordsman grimaced. "Well, I suppose we should start looking for the right time to strike. It'll probably be useless, but you never know." "I have to disagree," the helmeted hero interjected. "You really want to stand by and do nothing?" "Hardly, but I believe we will be more of use elsewhere. You heard the reports of an unknown super fighting this thing?" "I have. They were light on details." "Agreed, but if they are accurate, this unknown super did some damage to the creature. We should apply our skills to finding him or others already in the area." "You mean unsanctioned supers? You want to trust this to them?" "I said nothing about trust. We throw them at the enemy and see what happens. Either it falls, they do, or we learn something new." "Cold," the swordsman muttered, "but effective. Know where to look?" The helmeted hero tapped on his wrist guard, sending the data to the swordsman. The latter glanced back one last time at the battlefield, and then set his mind to the new task. Invincible rounded a corner and finally got a good view of the fight. The mechanical beast threw several soldiers into the air with a handful of tentacles, only for another handful to grab them and hold on to them. The first set of tentacles then ripped off their helmets before pressing themselves to the soldiers' foreheads. Invincible clenched his fists, and a spark flew from his hand. "Careful," Max said, stepping back. "Watch the gauges." Invincible didn't answer. Instead, he ran to the base of a tall building across from the battle. He hunched over and tensed his legs. Then, all at once, he sprang up, soaring into the air, flying parallel to the walls of the high-rise. When he reached the apex of his leap, he leaned over and kicked off with tremendous force. Flying from the springboard of the high-rise, he shot straight towards the creature and a new bundle of tendrils that were snaking towards the remaining fire team. He somersaulted midair once and then smacked into the silvery limbs feet first. The impact smacked the tentacles down to the now cracked pavement. Invincible immediately followed up by raising his arms and slamming them down on the taut metal tendrils stretched between his feet and their sockets in the machine's body 15 feet in the air. The strike severed 5 tendrils cleanly. The machine, apparently stunned, retracted the broken tendrils as it processed the best reaction. Too slow. Invincible leaped upwards once more and uppercut into the monster's belly. Unprepared, the thing was lifted into the air. Invincible was already winding up for another punch to send it flying, but a split second of inspiration, and he reached out with his other hand and grabbed the thing around its neck. Then he started pounding. The two of them began to fall, the dazed machine trailing tentacles, the blue and gold hero trailing electricity. They hit the ground, but Invincible didn't release the machine. He kept swinging at full force at its head. But somehow the delicate-looking eggshell white head wasn't cracking. Tiny imperfections, dents, were becoming visible, but just barely. Finally, one of the tentacles slithered up from behind. Wrapping itself around Invincible, it tried to pull him off. Invincible ignored it. A second and third tendril tried to do the same. Invincible released the thing's neck long enough to rip these tentacles from their sockets, then went back to wailing on the machine. Another tentacle wrapped tightly around Invincible's neck and tried to squeeze. Nice try, Invincible thought. While he felt some pressure, his throat didn't actually constrict. He was breathing just fine. Now, virtually all of these 24 tentacles tried to strike, pull, or otherwise dismount Invincible. They succeeded in distracting him from the main body. They failed to move him. In a flurry of blows and a blur of motion, Invincible struck at one tentacle, deflected another, wrapped 3 more under his arm, ripped the ends off of these, and used them to bat away 5 or 6 more, while his other arm was wrapped in another 2 or 3, only to leverage them against other tendrils and rip them off. The ball of muscle and electricity that was Invincible kept tearing through the spider like a savage, until it started to realize how outclassed it was in this position. A tendril shot out behind it, wrapping itself around a stout post, and pulled the body out from under Invincible. He immediately wrapped several of the limbs under each arm, dug his heels in, and held on, keeping the monster from moving. In response, it had the remaining free limbs fly outwards, grabbing onto anything it could to pull it free. In the giant tug-of-war, neither had an obvious advantage in strength, but Invincible had the weaker grip, relying only on his feet dug into the asphalt. He was pulled from his position and flew towards the body of the creature. But seeing an opportunity, he twisted his body so that he instead hit the side of a nearby building. The building now between him and the monster, he once more pulled, now at a much more advantageous position. The spider couldn't pull him from it this time, the super standing horizontally on the side of the building. As much as it heaved, Invincible wouldn't let go or allow himself to fall. In desperation, the spider let up for an instant, only so that it could yank back with a sudden, tremendous force, hoping that it would dislodge Invincible. If it had just let up on the pressure entirely, it would have been far more successful. Without it pulling Invincible towards the building he was standing on, he would have simply fallen back to the ground. But whatever the creature was, it clearly didn't consider that. Instead, when it pulled back with all its strength, Invincible hit a key pillar and was brought to a sudden stop. Refusing to release the tentacles, none got away at first. Not until some of the others stretched and ripped in half. Suddenly finding himself clasping these dangling ends, he wasn't applying the same pressure to the monster. A few more tentacles ripped, but a few managed to wriggle free. The tendrils retracted and began to slither out of the body once more, all repaired. Invincible braced for another leap at the monster, when suddenly a rain of bullets tore through the streets. The creature was hit harder than Invincible, obviously, but the impact still knocked him around just a little. Looking up, he saw a large aircraft belting out rounds from a rotating gun, a dragon breathing fire down upon them. After Invincible had charged in at the spider monster, Anna and Max saw the surviving fire team withdraw, many of their compatriots wounded. The two of them sprang from their hiding places and immediately offered their assistance, Max especially, as he could tend to their wounded. "Thanks for the help," one of the soldiers said. "I'm Sergeant Baker. We have more medical facilities back at base camp. I'd appreciate the help bringing some of these men back there. This thing has really torn up through our personnel. Base could use your assistance too if you're up for it, Doc." "Count on it," Max said. "Lead the way." Max was already carrying one of the wounded soldiers, Anna helping to carry another. "You guys don't have any idea what this thing is, do you?" Anna asked Sergeant Baker. "Besides giant mechanical spider?" "No, I do not, ma'am. No one seems to know where this thing has come from. It might not be my place to say, but I seriously think the brass are panicking at this one. Given the circumstances, I don't think that's much of a secret." "So it's probably not some weapons test gone wrong," Anna mused. "It doesn't look it to my eyes," Sergeant Baker replied cautiously. "But since when does the right hand know what the left is doing? I'd wager it's not Army, but I can't say more than that for sure." "I understand. Still, I've seen a few muck-ups in my time, and usually they're careful to keep them behind closed doors. This doesn't fit the profile, so to speak." "You think it's more likely something some mad scientist whipped up in his basement?" the soldier asked incredulously. "Well, no. Something this sophisticated, you need resources. Problem is, I can't imagine any group with enough resources that would want to do something that draws this much attention." "Well, sure you can," Sergeant Baker replied grimly. "Might not be anyone that the arm of the law can reach, or that the public can do something about, but there are forces beyond the reach of either of these. Foreign forces." "Yeah," Anna said hesitantly. "That seems like it makes the most sense, I guess. It's just that this attack, it's so blatant and pointless. The Russians or the Chinese wouldn't want to risk confrontation over something like this." "I suppose you do have a point there," Baker agreed. "Whoever's doing this seems to only want to kill and destroy. But anyone with the resources to build that thing would want more than just that, wouldn't they?" "That's what I'm thinking," Anna agreed. They reached the soldiers' base camp, and Max quickly went to work helping the wounded when Anna heard the thunderous roar of the Gatling gun coming from the street they had just vacated. Anna glanced around trying to see what was happening, but with the buildings between them, there was no clear view. Then she noticed what appeared to be the command staff standing around several computer screens. She saw on one a transmitted view from the cockpit of the plane unloading fire onto the creature and onto Invincible. Sergeant Baker saw the look on Anna's face. "This is absurd," Anna muttered to him. "Shouldn't they be cooperating?" "General MacAndrews is not a particular fan of unsanctioned supers," the sergeant responded. Anna took a closer look at the man with the general's insignia. She recognized him from somewhere. The Atlas fiasco, she suddenly realized. He had been one of the military personnel attending the expo, and he had been one of the first people to redirect personnel to capturing Invincible after he had won. "Is he really going to let that affect his command decisions?" Anna scoffed. "Surely enough people have died to make him see that it's pointless to do so." "Ma'am, the general isn't stupid," Sergeant Baker said defensively. "But Invincible is outside the chain of command and might seriously impair our ability to fight as much as he may help us. I'm personally grateful that he saved the lives of my fire team, and I owe him for that. But he is a wild card in this situation, and I'm sure the general believes that the situation would improve by taking such a wild card off the table." "But if he was coordinating with—" "I can't answer for the general, ma'am, but I think he would be a fool not to accept the help. And as I said before, he's no fool." "Dr. Weller," Anna said, pulling him aside as he was walking between wounded, "do you have a way to communicate with Invincible? Through his headset?" "I'm sorry, Miss Vasquez, but I'm busy. Why do you need to know?" "Because the Army's wasting time taking shots at him instead of the real threat. If we can get them to work together, we can end this. But I can't do that without communications." Max stopped and looked at her. "You're going to give it to the Army?" "No, of course not," Anna said. "I'm going to act as a relay and get the general here to see some sense." "You realize what that would mean for you, right?" "If the general is going to be so stupid as to try to arrest me or something, I can call down a swarm of other reporters to start screeching about freedom of the press or—" "Not what I meant. Even if this works, you'll be a known associate of Invincible's. You couldn't work with us anymore because someone will be keeping an eye on you to try and find who he is and where he is. Once the stunt is over, we'd have to move on without you." Anna paused. She hadn't considered that. Dr. Weller was right. If she did this, it would be the end of her collaboration with Invincible. "What choice do we have?" she finally said and held out her hand. Max paused a second and then put the comlink in her palm. As she ran off back towards the command station, she considered that her statement wasn't entirely accurate. She had choices, just no others that she could live with. She hoped the choice to never work with Invincible again would become easier to swallow too. "And you can prove that you can contact Invincible?" General MacAndrews demanded of the reporter that had just come forward to him. He didn't like the idea one bit. As far as he was concerned, an unsanctioned hero was someone who flagrantly flaunted civil authority, and as someone who deeply respected authority and the chain of command, it didn't sit right with him to give this one a free pass. "Yes, sir," Ana Garcia said. She activated the comlink and spoke into it. "Invincible, this is Ana Garcia. I'm trying to coordinate with the Army. I'm next to General MacAndrews right now." "Not a good time," Invincible said, straining as the fight continued. "Proof enough?" Ana asked. General MacAndrews considered. Idiots like Invincible weren't going to just leave his battlefield if they were asked nicely. Still, just having a line of communication didn't mean that they would be perfectly coordinated, and without perfect coordination, they could still easily get in each other's way. "General, call for you," one of his aides said. "It's from the Pentagon." General MacAndrews stepped away from the conversation to grab the phone. "Hello, General. This is Jeffrey Blake. I'm with the Federal Hero Agency." "I assume you're aware that I'm in the middle of a crisis, Mr. Blake," the General responded tersely. "This better be good, and it better be quick." "Sir, with all due respect, I think this will go down easier if we take it step by step." Go down easier. This was going to be bad news. "Can I take it that this will involve someone 1,000 miles away telling me how to handle the situation on the ground here?" "General, it doesn't have to be. We're both in agreement that the assets on site are the assets best suited to dealing with the situation, are we not?" General MacAndrews scowled. He saw the trap this Blake was laying. Using his words against him, he wanted the General to admit that using Invincible was the only viable option. If the Federal Hero Agency actually had someone on site, we wouldn't be having this discussion. Since when do you guys support unsanctioned heroics? "I personally do not, but you are mistaken when you say we don't have people on the ground. It is on their behalf that I'm making this call, and it is in their opinion that they will be ineffective unless the Army can coordinate with Invincible." "You have people on site that are holding back? Do you know how many of my men are dying out here?" "General, if you have a problem with their tactics, I suggest you file a complaint when this is all over. Of course, such a complaint would carry significantly less weight if you were found to be insubordinate." "Insubordinate!" the General practically shouted in outrage. "This type of threat is clearly outlined as one in which the Hero Agency is to take the lead. As such, I am well within my rights to formally request assistance from the Army, a request which cannot be refused. And in that scope, the FHA is strongly requesting that you cooperate with the unsanctioned hero known as Invincible, at least until such a time as the primary threat is eliminated. Do you need that in writing?" "No, Mr. Blake, I do not," the General said, suppressing his outrage. He handed the phone back to his aide and walked over to the reporter. "You want cooperation? Then here's Invincible's first orders," he said. Ana Garcia Vasquez was popping up in Invincible's ear every few seconds. He was finding it annoying. Supposedly, cooperating with the Army was going to bring this thing down faster, but most of the orders she relayed were micromanaging and keeping him only peripherally involved with the fight, only striking back when he was allowed to. This was extra frustrating because the spider seemed to have picked him as its favorite target, so even as he was ordered to shift position to clear a shot or what have you, the spider followed him and he ruined whatever plan the Army was coming up with. "This isn't working," Invincible said into his comm as he dodged and then broke a couple of tentacles. "We were doing better separate. At least when the Army was shooting me, they couldn't stop my attacks." "I know." Ana sounded just as frustrated on the other end. In a whisper, "Maybe we should call this off." Invincible didn't reply at first. He was seriously considering it. Having backup in the form of the Army was nice for a change, or it would have been if they were actually backing him up. But he also suddenly wondered what would happen to Ana if he cut the alliance short. She had risked a lot coming forward to the General, but with this monster on the loose, he couldn't afford to just sit back. Not after all it had done, to so many people. To Louis. "Stand by," Ana suddenly said. "Wait, what does that mean?" Invincible shouted back, but didn't get a response. He certainly wasn't going to be standing still, and Ana was crazy if that's what she meant. Invincible dodged a few more blows and considered risking pushing the advantage. The planes were circling for another run, and they needed the target clear to hit it. No sense in Invincible soaking up the damage instead of the spider. But so far, their other runs hadn't done much. Maybe it was time he took the initiative. "Invincible, change of plans," Ana said. 2 blocks back, there's a building that's being repaired. Lure that thing in there and engage. Does that mean kill it? Waste him. The army will keep him inside. You just do your thing. Invincible finally grinned. Now we're talking. As the next tentacle jabbed towards him, he leapt back, just out of its reach. Just as he expected, the spider machine crept forward to take another swing. Luring this thing would be easy. Invincible continued to dart out of the way of its strikes, making a few moves to strike at the beast here and there, but always retreating before getting bogged down. This kept it distracted from his overall goal of leading it back. It was easy to spot the building, a tall skyscraper damaged by the battle for Armageddon. There were cranes all around it, as well as construction material. It looked like much of the work was being done on the interior, though the outside had received a beating too. Invincible leaped into the air and then kicked off with both feet into the machine's skull. He used the repercussion of the strike to fly backwards through a window and into the building. He had been right. Most of the interior was stripped away, and he could see scaffolding running from the bottom to the top, with only portions of the floors still left. The monster hesitated in following Invincible. It was clear that the sprawling legs would have much less room to operate in there. But then the barrage of artillery and missiles from outside, peeling away at the aura of silvery limbs, quickly convinced it to dive inside as well. Invincible wasted no time. As soon as it dived through the window, Invincible pushed himself off a pillar and smacked into the thing in midair. The two fell downwards until some of the remaining tendrils wrapped around the scaffolding and halted them mid-fall. The monster now looked more like a fly that fell into a silvery web. Invincible, the predator, sitting atop its body. He quickly started smashing at the body this time, hoping to find a weak spot. The tentacles that had been shorn by the army's bombardment quickly reformed and struck at him. Invincible allowed himself to be pushed off, but grabbed at nearby scaffolding and then leapt to another nearby platform, and then did the same again until he had darted around the mess of tentacles. He started out at it again, hitting as he flew past, and then repeated the tactic. He tried coming at it from as many angles as he could, hoping the thing would entangle its tendrils in the scaffolding as it pursued him. And eventually, it did. Invincible took the opportunity to leap onto it once more and unleash his fury. He thought back to all the dead, dried husks he had seen, how this thing sucked the life out of everything that it touched. He channeled all of his own visceral strength into his blows, as if letting his own life force answer for all those this thing had taken. Part of the body dented, ever so slightly. The machine ripped its tangled tentacles apart and released the others holding the two of them aloft. They fell together towards the bottom of the tower until the creature shot out its limbs once more, bringing it to a sudden stop. Invincible wasn't quite as lucky. He slipped from the body and fell straight down, landing in a puddle of wet concrete. Immediately the spider dropped and landed all of its tentacles onto Invincible, including 2 on his head, and held him under, trying to drown him in the liquid concrete. Invincible struggled. Using all of his force, he shot out bursts of lightning, but the thing seemed to resist that too. He had to find a way out of this. As he squirmed, he felt his left foot hit the corner of something. It felt a bit pliable. He kicked out at it, putting in as much strength as he dared, and felt it shatter. The liquid concrete slowly started to drain away until a corner of his mouth was free. Now, even if it dried, his mouth was free and he could breathe. Then he could just break out. The monster seemed to realize this, and released him for just an instant. Or, more appropriately, part of the monster released him. The rest of the tentacles wrapped around his limbs, and then the beast began to rise, puppeteering Invincible like a rag doll. 3 tendrils for each of Invincible's limbs, together strong enough that they overpowered even him. Invincible hung in midair, spread eagle by the tentacles. The other 12 slowly leveraged the small eggshell body into view, floating a few feet in front of Invincible. And for the first time, the creature spoke. In a croaking, metallic-sounding voice, it said, "I'm so happy to see you. I have to admit, I was hoping to find you here. That is why I chose this city." Invincible grimaced. "Glad I could help." "And you can't imagine my joy when I saw that look of pain and anguish on your face. I have no idea who I killed to make you so upset, but rest assured, I am endlessly proud to have done it." Invincible raged at the words, straining with all his might against the tentacles that tied him. Instantly, lightning erupted from his body, striking the tendrils, but they didn't react. Even through his blind fury, he had enough sense to pull back just as he felt his powers about to break. "Not this time," the machine scolded. I have you right where I want you. Who or what are you? Invincible demanded. A fair question, the machine replied, and then started to turn, raising the front of its body until it was pointed straight up. A hiss of a pressurized container releasing the gases within foreshadowed the opening of the two halves of the heart-shaped body. Slowly, they split apart, opening like double doors on a cabinet. At first, Invincible only saw machinery, tubing, pulsating energy, and hoses. But as the body spread itself wide, Invincible could see a figure. Well, half a figure, resting inside. It was shriveled, arms wrapped over its chest, bony hands clutching its shoulders. The thin torso ended abruptly just above the hips, and Invincible thought he could see something of a mechanical spine hanging just below where it ended. The gaunt face was partly hidden behind a breathing apparatus, had looked like a muzzle, and was just the slightest bit familiar, though Invincible couldn't remember ever encountering such a man before, if he was still a man. Don't recognize me? The man asked. I don't blame you. My organic body is but a shell of its former self. We've met before? Oh yes. It's a day I could hardly forget, and judging by your disappearance, one that you can't either. It clicked in Invincible's mind. Cole? Kirby Cole? Astonishing, isn't it? I wouldn't have recognized myself in the mirror either, even if I hadn't gone through the Atlas program. Then again, if I hadn't, I wouldn't be here, would I? What happened? How did you escape? How did you get this thing you're wearing? It is a long story, so you'll just have to content yourself with the Cliff's Notes version. After you paralyzed me from the waist down, I was taken into custody by the military, as I'm sure you're aware. They and some other miscellaneous government agents quite efficiently disappeared me to some secret prison, presumably in the hopes to gain my secrets. Unfortunately for them, I was not so narrow-minded as to limit potential customers of the Atlas program to the United States or its allies. You'll forgive me for not disclosing my current benefactors, but needless to say, it only took a small lapse in security for them to acquire my services. I'm sure your government was exceptionally disappointed to discover that my Atlas program is only possible due to my unique, subtle power. Surprised? Don't be. It didn't manifest in me due to some whimsy of destiny or some sleeping deity. No, I don't need some sort of charity from luck. In my neurological studies, I discovered the neural energy that flows through us all, and through studying how it interacts with our brains, I discovered a way to use my brain to affect it. You made your own power? Invincible asked, astonished. Revolutionary, isn't it? Cole gloated. The technology is still in its infancy, but one day I will be able to create supers on a whim. I am the first stepping stone in a scientific revolution. My name will live on forever. Then why are you here? You've gotten everything you could want, haven't you? Oh, if only that were true. But you should know better. Our minds aren't made to truly appreciate the important groundbreaking events that shape history. No, our brains are far more petty. Because even as I worked on new technologies for my new patrons, I couldn't help but think back to you. Can you blame me, though? You left me paralyzed, half a man. I had to give up any dreams of returning to humanity. In a way, that was all for the better. I have found new creativity by ignoring the human form. But there is still some lingering bitterness from my human days. You couldn't be a big muscle man, so you cut off your lower half. Hate to break it to you, but you haven't changed as much as you think. You won't bait me. I'm past that. You were right that I let my ego get the best of me before. I was too blinded to consider the true possibilities my discovery allowed, such as my Jian here. Your what? This mechanical apparatus I designed. I named it the Jian, after a giant monstrous spider from Native American mythology. It was a 6-foot-tall spider, unkillable, because it hid its heart underground. I felt it was rather appropriate. Why, you want to rip out your heart along with your bottom half? You are as crude and idiotic as ever. Of course I didn't remove my heart. I simply found it metaphorically appropriate, though the invincible giant spider part is quite literal, as I'm sure you've discovered. Why don't you let me down and we'll find out how invincible it really is? I seem to remember you making that boast once before. This time, I assure you, it is far more appropriate. The armored shell of the body cannot be cracked, even by high ordnance. And while the tentacles are slightly more fragile, I am more than capable of indefinitely repairing them as you've seen. Not only can they drain the entirety of a person's neural energy, but I can use that same energy to reshape and reforge them. So as you can see, like the Hydra, even if you destroy one of them, they'll only come back. You like to keep talking, especially about your mythology. I remember one about a rabbit that wouldn't shut up about how great he was either. That is a fable, not a myth, Cole sighed. But fine. Let's finish this. You're not much for conversation anyway. A tentacle raised itself, poised above Invincible's head. You're very proud of your power, but as I've demonstrated before, calling yourself invincible is an exaggeration. For instance, it will not stop your neural energy from being drained. The tentacle made its way towards Invincible's forehead. He tilted his head to try to get away, but the tentacle just shifted slightly and continued its approach. Closer. Closer. Heads up, Anna's voice said in Invincible's ear. You have incoming. Before he could respond, a swordsman in blue and gray flew up past him, swinging his curved blade, which sliced through the tentacles holding his left arm and his left leg. But something was strange about the sword. It was covered in pitch-black, oily smoke which seared through the metal of the tentacles. Before Invincible could fully process the sudden appearance of this new fighter, 2 small glowing marbles of energy appeared and clung to the swordsman's back and boot. Suddenly, they pulled him from his upward trajectory and sent him flying past the body of the monster. Another swing of a shadow-covered sword, and the tentacles holding Invincible's right side went limp. He started to feel himself fall, only to somehow swing as if he were hanging from a rope that was posted in a point in midair, and he swung to a half-completed floor of the building. He glanced up just in time to see the swordsman swinging his black blade in midair. It was as if he tore open a hole in reality, but the gash in midair was pitch black, and then the swordsman flew straight in. Then, out from a shadow on the floor, he emerged, carrying his momentum onwards, but now directed upwards. He swung a second shadow blade and began slicing more tentacles, even as the first ones were re-emerging good as new. Another figure landed next to Invincible. This helmeted hero had gauntlets with lining that faintly glowed with the same purplish-blue energy as the marbles of light. Focus on the body. I'll lift you, he said, and held up one of the glowing gauntlets. Looking over, Invincible saw the glowing dots attaching themselves to his shoulders. The swordsman once more tore a hole open in reality, but this time Invincible saw that one of the shadows on an opposite wall darkened to pitch black just before he did so. When he entered the rip, he emerged from the blackened shadow at the same time. The tentacles are covered, the helmeted hero explained as the swordsman took care of more. You just worry about doing the damage. Invincible nodded. The helmeted hero hoisted up the points of light, and with them, Invincible. He flew upwards until he was level with the spider's body and wound up a punch to flatten the bug, but the regrown tentacles quickly pulled it away. Invincible saw a point of light spawn just behind the giant, and the helmeted hero below him suddenly pull his gauntlet downwards. As if there were an invisible string between the gauntlet, the point behind the giant, and the dots on his shoulders, Invincible was pulleyed towards the beast. No time to process that, Invincible prepared another strike. This too missed, but as the giant swung around to strike, the swordsman burst from the shadows and cut off the attacking tentacle. Invincible had an idea. He reached out for the tentacle, but he was swung around by the invisible strings of the helmeted hero and missed. "Hey!" he shouted back down. The helmeted hero looked up, expression unreadable behind that black and white helmet. "I was gonna use that!" The helmeted hero glanced at the falling piece of tendril, and then shot out more energy balls, one that caught in midair, and another that attached itself to the falling limb. Manipulating the unseen ropes, he pulled his arms this way and that, swinging Invincible upward into the air, and then back around, just as the broken piece of tentacle flew up towards his grasp. He caught it in midair just as the body of the giant slammed into him. Invincible tumbled out of the air before suddenly being yanked to a stop by his feet. The disorientation increased as he was swung around a couple of times, finally ending upright once more, but flying at the giant. Before he could adjust and was ready to swing his improvised bat at the thing, he was met by 7 tentacles that slammed him into the far wall, each pressing into him, holding him against the wall so he couldn't be whisked away by the points of light. The tentacles searched over him, trying to make their way to his forehead. Then they fell away as the Shadow Hero once more appeared from nowhere and cut them off. In an instant, he cut another shadow portal into the air and leapt in, appearing from a blackened shadow on the far wall and falling, both swords raised and shimmering with dark energy, towards the giant's back. As Invincible was pulled down and away from the monster, he saw and heard both shadow blades clack and deflect off the white body armor. Invincible was pulled onto the same platform as the helmeted hero. "You're losing focus," the hero rebuked. "You're making me lose my lunch," Invincible countered. "Less flips and throwing me around upside down, please." "Then stop worrying about which way your head is pointing, and just swing when you have the chance. Not the way this works. You work on not disorienting me, and I'll work on pulverizing coal." The helmeted hero stared for a brief instant, which was quite uncomfortable as none of his face was visible, just a cold, unchanging mask. "Fine, but I'm going to hit him fast. He's just one man, one brain in there. He can't possibly control all 24 tentacles naturally, so you better be ready to hit fast and exploit that." "Stop talking and throw me," Invincible replied, and to his credit, the helmeted hero immediately did so. Soaring straight up, Invincible saw the giant hunting the swordsman. "Don't worry about that. He'll back you up," Invincible thought to himself and charged his uppercut. He slammed into the unaware giant and immediately prepared a second strike. The helmeted hero obliged him by halting his ascent and redirecting him into the body of the machine. Invincible swung and swung, striking central mass of the body. He could see lots of movements in his peripheral vision and assumed them to be the tentacles. He didn't feel any impacts, however, and was sure he could attribute that to the swordsman in action. Suddenly, he was pulled up and away from the body. He was able to see that the giant had turned and was planning to squash him onto one of the incomplete floors. As the giant landed, it clearly got a glimpse of the helmeted hero, but before it could do anything, Invincible was hurled downwards at it. Invincible clasped his fists together above his head and slammed them down into the giant's back. Then he scrambled for the thing's neck, grasping one hand round it and trying to slam with the other all of his force into it. The head retracted slightly, just enough to cover the slightly weaker and flexible neck joint, forcing Invincible's fingers out of their spot. He saw a shadow pass over him once more and saw the pieces of tentacles fall away, but then realized this was just a distraction. 2 more tentacles shot forward and pulled the giant forward and flying towards the helmeted hero. The hero didn't lose focus for an instant. 2 points of light appeared on his feet and another high above him. He pulled downwards, but was shot upward, clear of the giant as it fell on the floor where the helmeted hero had just been. The spider managed to knock Invincible off and skittered off towards the helmeted hero, who was now in midair. The hero looked towards Invincible, who snatched one of the broken tentacle remnants and nodded. The helmeted hero disappeared all of the points of light, then created 3 new ones, one below himself, one above, and one attached to the middle of Invincible's giant eye on his costume. One arm stretched above and another below. The helmeted hero yanked himself downward. But the invisible string also went upward. But the invisible string ran from his arm, connected to the dot floating above the fight, before coming back down to Invincible. As the helmeted hero pulled himself down, the mystical pulley system pulled Invincible upward. It wasn't as precise as the previous launches, but it didn't matter. As Invincible flew past just a couple of feet from the giant, he swung viciously with his improvised weapon, knocking the machine around. He rolled and tumbled on his landing. Glancing back up, he saw that the helmeted hero had swung himself around just in time and was rising upward once more. The giant swung at him, and Invincible leaped, raising the tentacle above his head and slamming it down onto the giants. Knocked downwards, the machine spun until it was belly up. Then a mass of tentacles tangled themselves around Invincible's body, interweaving in a tangled mess they surely couldn't unravel. Oh. As the giants spun around again, Invincible shouted, "Wait, don't!" Too late, the swordsman was already on course and sliced through the tentacles that wrapped themselves around Invincible. But he cut near the base. If he had realized what was happening, he would have struck at the tentacles at the points where they wrapped around Invincible. Yes, he surely would have hit Invincible as well, but what did that matter? Invincible couldn't be hurt, and instead, he would be free. But now, the swordsman's slice only served Cole. The giant had been rapidly turning, and when the tentacles were cut loose, Invincible was sent flying towards the ground. At the same time, the tentacles were still entangled around him, trapping him. Meanwhile, the giant could simply regenerate the tendrils on its end. Invincible closed his eyes as the ground soared to him, more out of instinct than anything. He felt the impact, which stung slightly, even if it didn't injure him. Above, the giant had indeed regenerated and was focusing its effort on the two newcomers, the helmeted hero especially. After flicking aside the swordsman, it dove towards the helmeted hero, tentacles reaching out to strike. Acting quickly, the helmeted hero summoned nearly a dozen points of light, attaching many to the tendrils and pulling them back and apart like a blooming flower just before they hit him. The body was still flying forward and was nearly on him, but the helmeted hero's other arm pulled downward, swung a loose girder over his head and slammed it down into the giant. Still, as the giant fell and spun down the tower, one of the many tentacles, this one from the back, flew around and violently smacked into the hero. He was sent flying into one of the walls, bounced off, and began to fall. Out of a suddenly blackened shadow, the swordsman appeared and caught his partner. A mass of tentacles shot up towards them. The giant had caught itself and was once more on the offensive, but the swordsman had only one hand and one sword to defend himself and his partner. They were suddenly yanked backwards out of reach of the tendrils. The helmeted hero was still up and fighting, and the two quickly separated, heading off in opposite directions. But Cole saw which shadow darkened this time. The swordsman couldn't change directions mid-flight, only alter his momentum by choosing how he entered and exited each portal he created. Just as Invincible ripped through the last of the tentacles holding him, he saw the giant swing 3 times at the flying swordsman. The first missed. The second missed too and was sliced in half. The third found its mark and sent the swordsman smacking into one of the incomplete floors. He hit it face down and was clearly stunned. The giant didn't go to finish him off, however. It redirected towards the helmeted hero, who was swinging several pieces of debris into the machine. It batted them away. Invincible leapt upwards, landing on one floor before jumping to the next. They were still too far away. Some of the giant's tendrils were pulled away, but there were just too many. Like a downpour of enraged vipers, the tentacles bit into the helmeted hero. They began to rip off pieces of armor, especially the gauntlets. Invincible was still a story away as they went for the kill. A slash of shadow and they fell away. The swordsman prepared to bat away another assault. Invincible made sure he didn't have to. He landed on the giant's back, wrapped his left hand around the thing's head, and smacked with nearly all his force into the neck with his right. The thing was stunned even as it retracted its head for protection. It stumbled and fell backwards, Invincible holding on and wailing, watching as the force meters on the back of his hands went dangerously into the red, lightning engulfing the fighting pair. The swordsman turned towards the helmeted hero. Framed by the window behind him, the latter was the picture of disrepair. Nearly every inch of his armor was scarred, and the gauntlets were useless. Still, the helmeted hero unsheathed a knife from the red vest-like armor. The swordsman shook his head. "You're out," he said, looking past him to his shadow in the street visible through the window. Before the helmeted hero could protest, the swordsman flicked his blade, cutting open a portal and pushed the other through it. The helmeted hero landed in a heap on the empty street. Quickly getting back to his feet despite the aches in his bones, he saw the shadow the swordsman had blackened return to its normal darkness. The helmeted hero cursed himself under his breath. With now only Invincible and the swordsman left in the building, their mobility and hence their chances were greatly reduced. And yet, he recognized that there was nothing he could do in this state. He might as well head back to base. They needed a new plan. Whatever they did, They couldn't allow this giant to continue its rampage. He turned to head back when a thought struck him. Yes, that might work. He sprinted back towards the command outpost. The swordsman landed next to Invincible. We're one down. Fine, Invincible said, cursing inwardly. I didn't like getting tossed around anyway. Good. I was worried you needed the training wheels, the swordsman retorted. Same plan as before? Invincible asked. You can still punch, right? If you can still cut. The giant rose and dove towards them. The two heroes sprung into action. Invincible focused on leaping from floor to floor while taking huge swings at the body when he could, while the swordsman covered him. He didn't want to get caught clutching onto the body with no escape this time. For good measure, he cracked a few tentacles on his flights to reduce the giant's offense, but the number of tendrils flying around were getting to be too many. The machine could use any number of its limbs to move itself wherever it pleased in the damaged skyscraper, whereas Invincible and the swordsman were limited to leaping from point to point. The giant grabbed Invincible and threw him into a wall, diving towards him to continue the onslaught it didn't see as the swordsman appeared on its back. Extending his blade with shadow, he began to slice through every single tentacle on the machine, right at its source. Not fast enough. The giant turned itself upside down, and with just a single limb, pulled itself downwards, attempting to slam the swordsman into the floor. Invincible rolled into position and held up his arms just in time to stop the crush. The swordsman still hit the floor hard, and now the machine was regenerating limbs. The swordsman quickly opened a portal and dove through it. Invincible followed just before it disappeared. The two landed on yet another floor across from the giant, but it was already getting back to its feet. I don't suppose you have any more tricks? Invincible asked as the machine righted itself. Fresh out. You? I can hit him harder. Invincible balled his hand, looking at the meter on the back. He had been pushing himself this entire fight, truly unleashing his strength, losing his power. He doubted it would work even if he was willing to try, but they were running out of options. The giant reared back, preparing to leap at them. That should work, the swordsman said dryly, but they had no time to discuss. The giant attacked. Anna watched through the eyes of the swordsman on the monitor as the fight raged on. No matter what they tried, they couldn't seem to get an upper hand on the giant. And to think that it had been Kirby Cole this entire time. Too many questions about that still flitted back and forth through her head. The helmeted hero ran up towards General McAndrews. The general glanced at him. Looks like you heroes aren't having any more luck than we were with this thing. No, sir, the helmeted hero agreed. However, I believe now is the time for your men to shine. Son, I appreciate your renewed faith in the abilities of my men, but I don't make a habit of sending them into close quarters with monsters to be slaughtered. Not what I'm suggesting, sir. It may be possible to bury this giant. He's in an enclosed space, and we can drop it on him. Wait, what? Anna blurted out. Your partner is still inside, you realize, the general pointed out. You planning on killing him too? Negative, sir. He can warp out of there immediately. I am still in contact. And what about Invincible? Anna asked. He is invincible, isn't he? The helmeted hero asked coolly. And what if, buried under the remains of this skyscraper, he can't breathe? Did you think of that? She demanded. The helmeted hero shrugged. McAndrews grimaced. Collateral damage. Don't pull your man out until the last moment. Yes, sir. You can't do this! He was helping you! Anna protested. General McAndrews simply waved her off as he prepared the artillery strike. Being dragged away by a pair of soldiers, Anna shook herself free and then remembered the comlink. She grabbed it. Invincible, stick close to that other hero. Follow him through his escape portal. Inside the building, Invincible knocked aside a couple of tentacles. Escape portal? He asked, processing the words slowly as he concentrated on the fight. The swordsman was on the opposite end of the building as Anna shouted in his ear. Then he heard several thumps from outside. The swordsman reacted almost immediately, in panicked motions, as he ran towards a window and then cut a portal in midair and dove through. Then the shells hit. Everything was blown apart. Oh, that's what she meant, Invincible thought. No! Anna cried as even blocks away she could see the skyscraper fall, collapsing on Invincible and the giant. Slowly the tower fell downwards, tilting slightly as a wave of dust and debris rushed towards them. Anna still had the presence of mind to take cover as the debris rushed past in a torrent of sound and violent winds. After a few moments, it settled, leaving a thick haze in the air. She heard men shouting back and forth, making sure everyone was all right. For what it was worth, everyone sounded fine. But she couldn't think about that. She had to get someone to the rubble. If Invincible was trapped without air, time was of the essence. As she tried to flag someone down to help her, she heard a mighty wrenching of steel. She glanced back towards the ruin. A chill, then a violent shudder of horror crept over her body. 24 tentacles ripped bits of debris aside, until, slowly, the Giant raised itself out of the rubble. It raised itself high into the air once more, and then looked towards the camp, towards Anna. How will Invincible escape this prison of steel? Is there anyone capable of stopping Kirby Cole and his new Giant machine? Can the army, the two secret heroes, and Invincible's friends work together, or are there more betrayals in store? How can this threat finally be brought to an end? Find out next time on the Mirage Barrage.